February 25th, 1991. Southern Iraq. 0400 hours. Temperature, 5 degrees Celsius. Wind, still. A Soviet-built BMP-1 crests a low sand berm on the outskirts of the Iraqi town of Al-Busayya. Its diesel engine growls, treads chewing through soft dust. Inside, the Iraqi crew doesn't know they're seconds from death. A kilometer and a half away, hidden behind a shattered irrigation canal, an M2A1 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle lies motionless. Its gunner, an American corporal with night vision optics, tracks the BMP through the thermal sight. A green box pulses over the enemy vehicle. No warning, no movement. Just a single squeeze. The 25mm Bushmaster cannon opens fire. 5 armor-piercing rounds streak through the darkness in under 2 seconds. The BMP jerks sideways, its left track severed. Flames burst from its side hatch. The turret rocks once, then slumps. Its thin frontal armor, designed for speed, not survival, has folded under pressure. It was never built to withstand. 3 more BMPs appear, rushing to engage. The Bradley pivots, lays sight, and fires again. 1, 2, 3 vehicles destroyed. All within 90 seconds. Later, American troops would photograph the scene. Burning hulls, cooked-off ammunition, and dark scars in the desert sand. Inside one of the BMPs, a Soviet serial number remains visible. Burned, but legible. Back in Moscow, grainy satellite footage and early Pentagon briefings reach a Soviet Armored Doctrine Committee. The analysts frown. Their BMPs, the pride of their motor rifle regiments, are being hunted by a vehicle they had long dismissed as a lightweight American experiment. In a room off Kalinin Prospect, a Soviet colonel rewinds the tape, watches it again. "It's just a troop carrier," he mutters, but the numbers say otherwise. In the first 72 hours of Desert Storm's ground offensive, American Bradleys had destroyed over 400 armored targets, BMPs, BTRs, even tanks. And they had done it while transporting infantry across open desert under fire. The doctrine was dead. The belief that a thin-skinned troop carrier couldn't threaten Soviet armored formations? Dead in seconds. The Bradley hadn't just survived the battlefield, it had dominated it. Its optics saw farther, its rounds hit harder, its systems reacted faster. It wasn't a tank. It didn't need to be. It was a tank killer in disguise. And for the Soviet military watching from afar, the truth was now burning in the sand. The Americans didn't build a transport. They built a predator. Moscow, 1985. Ministry of Defense briefing room. Deep inside the General Staff building, a projector hums. On screen, a blurry image of the new American M2 Bradley IFV, taken by satellite over Fort Hood. It's squat, angular, and, by Soviet standards, strangely proportioned. The room is filled with colonels, analysts, and armored warfare veterans, and they're not impressed. One leans back and scoffs. Overweight, underpowered, too many electronics. This is what NATO calls progress? Another taps a slide showing the Bradley's aluminum armor. Can't stop a 73mm heat round. It's not a combat vehicle, it's a luxury taxi with a cannon. The consensus is simple. The Bradley is a compromise machine. A political weapon, not a battlefield one. Soviet doctrine, forged in steel and reinforced through numbers, sees the battlefield differently. Their own IFV, the BMP series, is built for speed, mobility, and mass deployment. A BMP can swim rivers, race at 65 km, and carry a full squad into battle under nuclear, biological, or chemical threat. Its profile is low. Its gun is lethal. And most importantly, it can be produced by the thousands. By 1985, the Soviet Union had fielded over 20,000 BMP-1s and BMP-2s, with export models scattered across Warsaw-Pact nations, the Middle East, and Africa. These machines weren't pretty, but they were everywhere. And in Soviet eyes, that was power. The Bradley, by contrast, was seen as a boutique weapon. It carried fewer soldiers. It weighed more. It cost more. And worst of all, it tried to do too much. Carry troops, destroy tanks, provide fire support. All in one chassis. Jack of all trades, one general says, means master of none. They point to its 25mm cannon and scoff. It won't penetrate a T-72. Why put such a big gun on a troop carrier? They ignore what that gun can penetrate. Everything lighter than a main battle tank. They dismiss its TOW missile launcher, calling it impractical for fast-moving fights. They downplay its thermal imaging and laser range-finding systems, insisting that Soviet formations will outnumber and overwhelm such boutique units in any real war. In their minds, the Bradley is what happens when a peacetime army designs a war machine. Expensive, over-engineered, and untested. Their BMPs, on the other hand, are proven. They've fought in Afghanistan, in Africa, in proxy wars from Angola to Egypt. They've been blooded and survived. So when Soviet command sees the Bradley enter the field, they smile. It's not fear they feel, it's contempt. Because in their model of war, the Bradley is solving a problem that doesn't exist. They never ask what happens if the problem is them. In Soviet mechanized doctrine, the infantry fighting vehicle was never designed to fight alone. It was a support asset, a metal chariot to deliver infantry into the shadow of tanks. BMPs weren't hunters. They were shields. Born from the battlefield demands of the 1960s and refined by the bitter experience of Afghanistan, the BMP family was built on three principles: speed, capacity, and survivability by movement, not armor. The BMP-1 introduced a revolutionary concept. Mounted infantry could fight from inside the vehicle, firing through ports in NBC-sealed cabins. It had a low silhouette, amphibious capability, and a 73mm cannon paired with a Malutka ATGM. The BMP-2 improved firepower with a rapid-firing 30mm autocannon and better anti-air capabilities. Soviet doctrine paired BMPs with tanks. Always tanks. The idea was to overwhelm NATO defenses with massed armored waves. Infantry would dismount only once the enemy's front line had cracked. Until then, they were passengers. BMPs were not designed for long duels. They had thin armor, vulnerable to autocannons and shaped charges. Their main defense was being a small target moving fast. This model worked in theory, especially in Europe, where short engagement distances and terrain gave cover to advancing units. In Red Square briefings, the war plan was elegant. Tanks absorb fire. BMPs follow close behind. Dismounts secure objectives. Overwhelming numbers win the day. But this doctrine had two fatal assumptions. First, that NATO would not possess an armored vehicle capable of detecting, targeting, and destroying BMPs before they could return fire. Second, that an IFV's only role was transport. The Bradley shattered both assumptions. Its design flipped the Soviet concept inside out. Instead of hiding behind tanks, it hunted armor with tanks beside it. Instead of waiting to dismount, it used its optics and turret to kill from a distance, often before infantry ever engaged. The U.S. doctrine behind the Bradley was born not from numbers, but from firepower per vehicle. Each Bradley was expected to win its own fights, not just survive long enough to drop off troops. It could engage targets at 2,500 meters. It had thermal sights that could see through smoke, night, and sandstorms. Its TOW missiles could penetrate 600 millimeters of armor, more than enough for any Soviet IFV or even early-generation tanks. And its crew didn't wait to be ambushed. They looked for enemies first, and killed fast. This wasn't a support platform, it was an ambush machine. And the Soviet doctrine, designed for shock, speed, and numbers, had no answer for a vehicle that could erase its spearheads before they crossed the first kill zone. In the open desert, in the plains of Central Europe, in the battle maps they had practiced for decades, the BMP was suddenly outclassed. It had no more protection, no more speed advantage, no more role. And no doctrine can survive the battlefield when the enemy rewrites the rules at 2,500 meters. February 23, 1991. Southern Iraq. H-hour -3. The ground war hasn't officially begun, but the Bradleys are already moving. Somewhere near the Saudi-Iraqi border, units from the U.S. 1st Infantry Division are advancing under cover of night. Their Bradleys form the spearhead, sleek, fast, armored, and loaded with sensors that pierce the desert darkness. On the other side, in the Iraqi 12th Armored Division's sector, Soviet-supplied BMP-2s lie in dug-in positions, ready to repel a mechanized assault. Their gunners squint through night vision scopes. Primitive Gen Zero technology, fogged by sand and static. They never see what's coming. A single TOW missile arcs from a Bradley's launcher at 3,500 meters, well beyond the BMP's detection range. It flies low, guided by wire, whispering through the air with deadly precision. Impact. The BMP erupts in a column of flame, its ammunition cooking off instantly. The dismounted squad nearby, too close, dives for cover. Another Bradley opens up with its 25mm cannon, sweeping across a second position with armor-piercing sabots that rip through thin Soviet steel like foil. Within 3 minutes, 4 BMPs are gone. There is no response fire, no counterstrike, just wreckage. The Iraqi units break formation and scatter, some vehicles fleeing, others abandoned. They were supposed to hold the line for hours. They didn't last 10 minutes. News of the engagement reaches CENTCOM via encrypted burst. Enemy BMPs destroyed. No U.S. casualties. Continuing advance. But in Moscow, it filters in through more shadowed channels. GRU analysts, monitoring Western broadcast intercepts and satellite chatter, pick up fragments. Claims of Bradleys eliminating armored vehicles before any exchange of fire. American public briefings list confirmed kills by IFVs, figures that include not just BMPs, but tanks. The numbers seem wrong, impossible, fictional. IFVs aren't supposed to engage armor directly. They're not meant to take the lead. And yet, Bradleys are doing both. Reports show the M2s using TO-BUPS missiles at maximum range, coordinating their attacks across desert terrain using encrypted radio and real-time positioning. BMPs, relying on visual confirmation and basic optics, simply can't respond in time. The battlefield is now asymmetrical. The Americans don't see BMPs as threats. They see them as targets. In Soviet war colleges, this scenario had never been simulated. BMPs were supposed to overwhelm, outmaneuver, and support, but always under the protective curtain of tanks and artillery. No one planned for an IFV that moved like a scout and hit like a sniper. Yet here it was, a vehicle dismissed as an overpriced taxi now leading the charge, racking up kills, and changing the rules of engagement in real time. For decades, Soviet engineers had insisted that Western IFVs would break the moment they entered a real battle. But the Bradley didn't break. It broke them. Back in Moscow, inside a steel-paneled chamber beneath the Ministry of Defense, a classified briefing unfolds. Grainy satellite footage, intercepted Pentagon reports, and blurry CNN combat clips flash across the screen. The Americans are claiming that infantry vehicles, Bradleys, are destroying armored columns. BMPs, T-55s, even command vehicles, and they're doing it from standoff distances that defy Soviet engagement parameters. At the head of the table, a gray-haired general narrows his eyes. "Propaganda," he mutters. The room agrees, at first. To the Soviet High Command, the idea that an IFV could independently engage and destroy armored vehicles was a Western fantasy. They remember the M113, the lightly armored, boxy troop transport that defined American mechanized units for decades. In their minds, the Bradley is a slightly better version, faster, maybe, and armed, but not dangerous. The footage shows otherwise. One clip, later leaked, depicts a U.S. Army Bradley identifying a target at night, an Iraqi BMP-2, firing a TOW missile, and destroying it before the enemy can rotate its turret. The kill is clean, precise, cold. Still, the Soviet officers remain skeptical. One colonel offers a theory. They're exaggerating. Abrams tanks must be assisting, or air support. Bradleys alone don't have that kind of kill power. Another, a GRU technical analyst, raises a hand. Satellite photos show TOW launcher deployments from multiple Bradleys in a single formation. They're operating as independent fire teams. The room falls silent. If the footage is accurate, and the telemetry matches, then the Bradley is more than a mobile gun. It's a networked hunter, using sensors, thermal imaging, and fire-and-forget weaponry to destroy Soviet-supplied armor before it even lines up a shot. But the old guard isn't ready to accept that. They circle back to their comfort zones, production stats, armor thickness, doctrinal superiority. "We've built 20,000 BMPs, one general snaps. "What can they field? A few thousand Bradleys?" Another leans forward. "And yet those few are doing what our units cannot defend against." A pause. The silence isn't technical. It's existential. Because if a handful of IFVs can wipe out full battalions equipped with Soviet armor, then it's not just the vehicles that are vulnerable. It's the doctrine. But instead of confronting the data, the High Command does what it has always done in moments of inconvenient truth. They delay. They demand more footage, more reports, better confirmation. They label U.S. battlefield claims as psychological operations. They insist on full visual kill logs before accepting American numbers. Even as the evidence mounts, hundreds of destroyed BMPs, dozens of tanks neutralized by non-tank vehicles. They hold to the belief that this must be deception. It's easier to believe in manipulation than in failure. Easier to call it exaggeration than admit that the battlefield has changed and left them behind. In war rooms across the Soviet Union, maps still show formations of BMPs storming through the Fulda Gap, sweeping aside NATO defenders in a wave of fire and steel. But in the deserts of Iraq, that fantasy is burning, and it's burning fast. After repeated footage showed Bradleys destroying BMPs and even tanks from long range, Soviet analysts scrambled to rationalize the battlefield outcomes. If the American IFV wasn't just lucky, then it had to be cheating. The dominant theory that emerged inside GRU technical circles was dubbed the cover doctrine dependency. In this model, the Bradley's kill rates weren't the result of its own capabilities, but of its proximity to M1 Abrams tanks and air superiority assets. The GRU's first major post-battle analysis claimed, Bradley fire missions are coordinated with main battle tanks or rotary wing aircraft. The IFV is not engaging independently, but serving as an opportunistic shooter, masked by heavier units. This theory was politically convenient. It preserved the narrative that the Soviet BMPs were still tactically viable, just misused by poorly trained Iraqi units. It suggested that without American tank support, the Bradley would revert to what Soviet planners always assumed it was, a thin-skinned support vehicle. The problem? It wasn't true. Captured U.S. after-action reports told a different story. Units from the 1st Armored Division, the 3rd Infantry Division, and others reported multiple incidents of Bradley platoons operating in split formations, deliberately outpacing Abrams units to scout forward. These Bradleys weren't hiding behind tanks. They were hunting ahead of them. In one engagement near Medina Ridge, a Bradley crew logged 6 vehicle kills, including 2 BMPs and a T-55, before the first Abrams round was even fired. Thermal optics and laser rangefinders gave the Bradley a decisive edge in first detection and engagement range. Its 25mm Bushmaster cannon was accurate out to 2,500 meters. The BMP-2's 30mm, in contrast, had a far shorter effective range, and poor night fighting optics made it nearly blind under real combat conditions. Another flaw in the cover doctrine theory? The numbers. Bradleys recorded more direct fire kills than many Abrams tanks in the opening phase of Desert Storm. They weren't tagging along. They were doing the killing. Soviet attempts to cling to the theory began to crack. A secret briefing from the main intelligence directorate in early March 1991 admitted, engagement patterns indicate autonomous targeting behavior. Bradley IFVs are initiating and completing fire sequences independently of MBT coordination. Still, the political inertia inside the Soviet military prevented a shift in thinking. They doubled down on the claim that BMPs weren't defeated by superior vehicles, but by American air dominance and combined arms saturation, as if denying the Bradley's capabilities would erase what had happened in the desert. But the battlefield didn't lie. And every theory built on excuses was shattered by a single fact. Bradleys weren't hiding. They were out front. They were alone. And they were winning. As the first explanations crumbled, Soviet analysts reached for another theory, this one rooted not in American support systems, but in American fragility. If the Bradley was indeed effective at engaging targets, they argued, it must come at a cost. It had to be vulnerable, lightly armored, and easy to kill once engaged. This became the next doctrinal myth. The Bradley can kill, but it can't survive. It was a comforting assumption. After all, Soviet IFVs like the BMP-1 and BMP-2 weren't designed for heavy armor either. They relied on speed, low profiles, and sheer numbers. If the Bradley simply represented a different take on the same light concept, then parity was still within reach. Briefings began emphasizing survivability weaknesses. Diagrams of the Bradley's aluminum hull circulated in Soviet armor academies, showing supposed structural vulnerabilities. Officers were told its fuel tanks were exposed, that its TOW launcher was too slow to deploy under fire, that its rear compartment was a coffin. But once again, reality refused to cooperate. Combat data from Desert Storm revealed a shocking imbalance. In dozens of direct fire incidents, Bradleys versus BMPs, the American vehicles not only destroyed their targets, but often survived return fire. BMPs, hit by 25mm sabot rounds, cooked off instantly. The thin steel of their hulls couldn't contain the blast. Fuel tanks exploded. Ammunition detonated. Crews rarely escaped. Bradleys, when hit, showed a different story. Yes, some were damaged. Some were destroyed. But survivability rates for crew and dismounted infantry were significantly higher. Internal fire suppression systems kicked in. The armor, while not tank-grade, was modular, able to be upgraded with reactive bricks and spaced plating. More importantly, Bradley doctrine prioritized standoff range. Most BMPs never even got close enough to fire back. They were identified through thermals, targeted via laser rangefinders, and engaged at distances that rendered their own weapons useless. A classified U.S. Army report later noted, in over 150 vehicle-on-vehicle engagements, not a single Bradley was lost to direct fire from a BMP. The myth of fragility didn't survive the battlefield. Even the Iraqi crews, trained under Soviet doctrine, realized too late that the Bradley was not a mirror image of their own machines. It was something else entirely, a killing platform, engineered not just to carry troops, but to ensure they arrived after the enemy was already dead. The Soviet theory had missed the point entirely. They looked at the Bradley and saw another transport. But it wasn't built to deliver men into fire. It was built to eliminate the fire before anyone dismounted. By the time BMPs got a lock, they were already burning. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet intelligence apparatus watched the M2 Bradley with the same lens it had used for decades, focused on tanks, aircraft, and nuclear payloads. Infantry fighting vehicles were never prioritized, and that was the fatal blind spot. The GRU, tasked with military technical reconnaissance, routinely gathered specs on NATO's main battle tanks, especially the M1 Abrams. Countless man-hours were spent analyzing turbine engines, composite armor, and 120mm KE penetrators. Meanwhile, the KGB, through its Directorate T, monitored U.S. defense procurement and industrial production. Their informants inside defense contractors hinted at a controversial program called the Bradley, a vehicle over budget, overdue, and under political fire. A congressional hearing had even declared it unsafe. The Soviets took this at face value. They filed the M2 under tactical non-priority. They missed what it was becoming. Had they looked deeper, they would have seen a pattern. Live fire trials showing high mobility in harsh terrain, unit formations in Germany modifying doctrines around combined arms penetration tactics, and the rapid integration of digital fire control systems, years ahead of Soviet equivalents. But the GRU kept its gaze fixed on tanks. And when the KGB did report on Bradley developments, they emphasized scandal over substance, weight creep, maintenance complexity, and interbranch infighting over its role. A 1986 GRU memo labeled the Bradley an IFV with theoretical firepower, practically unproven, vulnerable to direct fire, poor cost efficiency, designed for psychological superiority, not tactical impact. That assessment aged poorly. During Desert Storm, real-time combat telemetry, intercepted from NATO communications and confirmed via post-conflict imagery, showed Bradleys engaging and destroying Soviet-made equipment with frightening efficiency. BMPs, BTRs, even older T-series tanks. The kill data was logged. Locations were matched to destroyed units. Yet the KGB refused to update their assessments. They clung to the idea that the Iraqi crews were poorly trained, that battlefield visibility was skewed, that the numbers were doctored for public consumption. Worse, when frontline Soviet advisors embedded with Iraqi units reported the real story, Bradleys acting as vanguard units, knocking out armor columns before they could even enter firing range, those reports were buried. Too disruptive, too damaging. In a closed-door review following the war, a GRU colonel privately admitted, "We prepared to fight their tanks. We ignored the platform that killed more armor than the Abrams." By the time the truth was accepted, the damage was irreversible. Soviet doctrine had trained its soldiers to fear tanks, to respect helicopters, and to expect IFVs to serve quietly behind the line. But the Bradley never stayed behind. It wasn't just a transport vehicle. It wasn't just a gun. It was a platform designed to break the Soviet model itself. And because the KGB and GRU failed to recognize that shift, their soldiers were caught unprepared. The BMPs rolled into battle and were erased before the second shot. The M2 Bradley wasn't a fluke. It was the result of a doctrinal evolution, a Cold War gamble that paid off with terrifying efficiency. To the Soviets, it looked like a misguided hybrid, part transport, part tank, part scout. But in practice, the Bradley was a symphony of lethality, where sensors, weapons, armor, and tactics combined into something no Soviet theorist had planned for. Start with the gun. The 25mm M242 Bushmaster wasn't just a cannon. It was a precision autocannon, capable of firing up to 200 rounds per minute with selectable ammo types. High-explosive rounds shredded infantry. Armor-piercing sabot rounds cut through BMPs like paper. No Soviet IFV, even the BMP-2, could withstand direct hits from the Bushmaster, especially when fired from standoff range. And that range was critical. Bradleys didn't have to get close. Their thermal optics, paired with laser rangefinders, gave them eyes that pierced sandstorms and darkness. While BMP crews relied on basic night vision or direct line of sight, the Bradley could detect, track, and engage targets over 2 kilometers away, long before the enemy knew they were being watched. Then came the missiles. The Bradley carried TOW-2 anti-tank missiles, tube-launched, optically tracked, and wire-guided. With a range of up to 3,750 meters and penetration capability of over 800mm RHA, it could kill any Soviet tank on the battlefield. T-72s, T-80s, even T-64s, before they could get in gun range. But the real power of the Bradley wasn't any single weapon. It was how the entire system worked together. Inside the turret, the commander and gunner operated in a hunter-killer loop. The commander scanned independently from the gunner, identifying new threats, marking targets, and passing off firing solutions in seconds. While Soviet crews operated sequentially, Bradleys worked simultaneously, always one step ahead. Its armor? Modular and upgradable. Initial models were aluminum, yes, but by Desert Storm, many Bradleys had received spaced armor and ERA, explosive reactive armor, enough to defeat RPGs and light autocannons, enough to survive most Soviet IFV fire. And it didn't just protect the vehicle, it protected the crew. Internal spall liners, automatic fire suppression, and escape hatches turned survivability into strategy. Bradleys didn't just kill more. They lost fewer men doing it. In 73 Easting and Medina Ridge, Bradleys took fire, returned fire, and stayed in the fight. BMPs, by contrast, burned with a single penetrating hit. And then there's the dismount squad. 6 fully armed infantry rode in the back. But they didn't just sit and wait. They coordinated. Bradley commanders used encrypted radios to maneuver squads with tanks, artillery, and air support. The vehicle wasn't an armored bus. It was a command node, linking infantry and armor into one coherent assault system. On paper, the Bradley had less armor than a tank, fewer troops than a BTR, a smaller gun than a T-72. But on the battlefield, it saw farther, shot faster, hit harder. It outclassed the BMP in every category that mattered, from fire control to survivability, from target acquisition to crew efficiency. The Soviets had believed the future belonged to mass production and mobility. But the Americans had gambled on integration, and the Bradley was the result. A machine that didn't just break enemy lines. It rewrote the very nature of mechanized warfare. February 26, 1991. The Battle of 73 Easting. The sandstorm had just cleared when the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment encountered Iraq's 18th Mechanized Brigade, a force outfitted with Soviet-made BMPs and T-72s deployed in dug-in positions, stretched across the featureless desert. It was supposed to be a defensive wall. It became a slaughter. Captain H.R. McMaster's Eagle Troop crested a ridge and spotted enemy armor at 1,200 meters. His Abrams tanks took the first shots, but what followed wasn't a tank duel. It was a Bradley massacre. The M3 cavalry variant of the Bradley, armed with the same 25mm cannon and TOW missiles, advanced under fire, not behind the Abrams, but beside them. The Bradleys scanned, targeted, and engaged Iraqi BMPs before the Iraqis even realized they were under threat. A single Bradley, call sign Killer 11, fired 4 TOW missiles in under 10 minutes. All 4 found targets. 3 BMPs, 1 T-55. None returned fire. The Bushmasters opened up next. Quick bursts of armor-piercing rounds, shredding vehicle hulls, cracking turrets, and igniting internal fuel. In one sector, a Bradley platoon destroyed 9 vehicles in less than 5 minutes, all while maneuvering and relaying enemy positions in real time to adjacent units. It wasn't a brawl. It was an execution. The Iraqi defenders, trained under Soviet models, attempted to counter with massed formations. But their BMPs couldn't get close. Their optics were blind in the dust. Their gunnery systems were analog. Their armor, once considered sufficient for peer conflict, crumpled against the Bradley's fire. By the time the 2nd ACR finished its engagement at 73 Easting, the battle map was clear. Over 160 enemy vehicles destroyed, including dozens of BMPs, 0 Bradleys lost in the main engagement. Bradley units confirmed more vehicle kills than Abrams in some subsectors. For Soviet observers watching through satellite telemetry and Iraqi radio intercepts, the outcome was catastrophic. A vehicle they had labeled too light, too slow, too exposed had just dominated an armored formation designed in their own image. Back in Moscow, a GRU after-action review circulated privately. The American IFV demonstrates combined firepower, target acquisition, and engagement ranges that exceed BMP doctrine thresholds by 400–800 meters. Counter-engagement is ineffective. Translated, our IFVs can't fight back. Worse still, the Bradleys weren't fighting with tanks. They were fighting like tanks, engaging, maneuvering, coordinating. They didn't wait for orders. They made contact first, then relayed targets for cleanup. No Soviet formation had been trained for that. The battle didn't just humiliate Iraqi crews. It shattered the confidence of the Soviet military establishment. Because if the Americans could win so decisively with what was supposedly a support vehicle, then the problem wasn't just the Bradley. The problem was everything. The vehicles, the doctrine, the assumptions, and most of all, the idea that mass could beat precision. In the war rooms of the Soviet General Staff, the numbers coming out of Desert Storm weren't just painful, they were paradigm-breaking. American Bradleys had destroyed over 1,500 enemy vehicles, including hundreds of BMPs, BTRs, and even main battle tanks. Not as support, not as rear guard, but as front-line killers. In some units, the Bradleys accounted for more armored kills than the tanks they accompanied. This was never supposed to happen. Soviet doctrine had always assumed superiority through volume. Waves of mechanized infantry rolling across open plains, overwhelming NATO positions through fire and mass. The BMP was not a perfect machine. It didn't need to be. Its value was in the scale. But in the sands of Iraq, that model collapsed. Every advantage the Soviets thought they had, mobility, production speed, adaptability, was neutralized by a single fact. The Bradley fired first. And once it fired, the fight was over. The Gulf War exposed a generational failure in Soviet battlefield theory. It revealed that American strategy had evolved beyond numbers and into systems. Vehicles that didn't just fight, but thought. That coordinated, detected, killed, and survived with machine precision and digital coordination. In this new paradigm, the Bradley was the linchpin, not a tank, not a scout, but something in between, a modular killer with the reach of artillery, the reflexes of a drone, and the survivability of a mobile fortress. And the Soviets had nothing like it. Their closest answer, the BMP-3, was still under development when the Gulf War exploded. It was heavier, yes, and better armed, with a 100mm gun and improved optics. But it was still trapped in the old doctrine: deliver troops, support tanks, survive if you can. It was not designed to destroy first. And in this new age of preemptive warfare, that meant it was obsolete before it rolled off the assembly line. The ideological collapse came soon after. If American IFVs could defeat Soviet formations before they even returned fire, then what other Soviet assumptions were broken? Could their tanks stand up to modern optics? Could their air defenses stop stealth? Could their missiles hit what they couldn't see? The Bradley raised these questions not with propaganda, but with kill logs. It proved that precision and information could overwhelm armor and firepower. That 5 Bradleys, working as a unit, could dismember entire mechanized battalions, not just survive, but dominate. By the time Soviet planners adjusted, the Cold War was already over. The walls were falling. The empire was cracking. But in the ashes of doctrine, one fact remained. The Americans had built a machine to kill Soviet war plans. And it worked. Today, a Bradley IFV stands parked outside Fort Stewart, Georgia. Its desert tan paint is chipped, its tracks rusting slightly from rain. To a casual visitor, it's just another Cold War relic, an armored box on treads, a museum piece. But to those who know, it's something else entirely. It's a warning. This unassuming machine, shorter than a school bus, lighter than a tank, rewrote the rules of mechanized warfare. It didn't need a massive gun. It didn't need thick armor. What it had was vision, precision, range, and the ruthlessness to fire before the enemy knew it was there. Inside its hull, dozens of Soviet-designed BMPs met their end. Their wrecks now litter the Iraqi desert, melted into sand, twisted by heat, and forgotten by history, but the legacy remains. The Bradley didn't just win battles. It exposed a fault line in Soviet thinking, the belief that mass and simplicity could still dominate the battlefield. It revealed that modern warfare had moved beyond line charges and steel waves. It was now a game of speed and sensors, of milliseconds and meters, of who could see first and shoot sooner. And no Soviet planner saw that coming. Today, Russia still fields variants of the BMP line. Updated, modernized, retrofitted. But at their core, they remain tied to a doctrine the Bradley helped shatter. A doctrine where infantry rides into fire, hoping to outnumber the shooter. But the Bradley never cared about numbers. It just found its target and pulled the trigger. It didn't roar. It didn't inspire fear. It simply erased whatever sat in its sights. In a war filled with stealth bombers and main battle tanks, the quietest killer was a 7-meter-long tracked vehicle carrying 6 men and a gun no one took seriously. Until it was too late. The Soviets laughed at the Bradley. Then they watched their war machines burn.